So I was by name requested by OSD to move into the DC area to pick up the job of being the administrative assistant to the director of AFIS AFRTS, and that encompassed as administrative assistant. Basically, I was the admin officer, and I was responsible for the AFRTS headquarters budget, all personnel actions, all administrative actions, and a bunch of other odds and ends, that sort of flow along with that.
So you're kind of applying your AG knowledge along with your background of.
This was a very, realistically, it was taking the best of what I knew, with a master's in business, and I have master's in radio and television, and I had a bachelor's degree in television as well. So this basically was like an ideal position for me, and I flourished professionally, and I flourished individually in that role. I had a tremendous amount of say-so in what we did at an organizational level at such a low rank. Because I would go to, for instance, I would have to defend the AFRTS budget to the OSD comptroller. Well, AFIS was referred to as an other defense agency. So we had a pecking order where we were not quite a defense agency because we weren't fully autonomous, because we were always under OSD Public Affairs. But we operated a lot like the DOD school system, DODDS. Okay, so when we go to budget meetings, I would compete with DODDS. Well, I'm sitting there with a relatively small budget and a very focused environment, and DODDS is sitting there with $1 billion budget. So I'm competing for television cameras, tape recorders, and this sort of thing, and they're next to me competing for wrestling mats and musical instruments, and these got to be kind of funny, budget discussions, because we're all in the same boat together. And furthermore, we were also competing with Washington headquarters services, because anything that we had was against their budget line item. But successfully, in my duration there, when I signed on, my budget was $18 million. And I had to run that on an Excel spreadsheet before Excel spreadsheets. I actually had to do all the calculations, by myself, just with a calculator and a tape, and I ran an $18 million budget that way over several organizations. So I did that for a while, and was I'd say relatively successful at it. When we got to the point where we were going to move from a film or videotape based operation into the satellite world, we generated something called Armed Forces Radio and Television Satellite Network, or SATNET. Mm-hmm. Okay, there were three of us in that vein. We had Larry Pollock, an Air Force major, was in charge of operations, and he was a longtime AFRTS guy. We had James Barham, who was a civilian, and he was more into the computers, technology, and he has a long history that predates a lot of the AFRTS stuff. And then I was the third member of that tripod, and I was responsible for developing the criteria for staffing, budgeting, and operating the satellite network. And so to that extent, then we had studies done, and we had to report to Congress, because we had, we're putting in satellite dishes in foreign countries. And the three of us actually made several overseas trips. We go to the BBC. We had to announce to the BBC what our intentions were to put a satellite dish, for instance, in Diego Garcia, which is a British island in the Indian Ocean. And they're going, really? Is that us? Are we there? Yes, we need your permission to do that. We had to go to Italy to get permission to bring a satellite dish into the military there, into Vicenza. We had to go to Japan I didn't go to Japan, but the other guys went to Japan to allow us to bring a satellite dish into Japan. Korea the same way. When we actually got that thing up and running, we actually brought color television into Japan before the Japanese put it in Japan. So we had a couple of interesting boo-boos. But in developing that, and I have all of the documentation on how that came about, but I took the $18 million budget, and by the time I left, which was 2.5 years, 3 years later, I had justified the budget up to $100 million.
Wow.
So that was, and in so doing, the director, AFI's director, Robert Cranston, and I, he was required to appear before the House Appropriations Committee, like, what are you guys doing? And so I prepared the background briefing books on my portion of it, and accompanied him to the Hill for those hearings. One of the very few times that I was at AFIS where I actually wore a uniform.
So, I mean, bottom line to all this is, you brought 20th century information to the armed forces around the world with the best technology available.
Well, it was the best technology, but we had
the importance of that for a troop on the ground. That's
yeah, but but one of the other driving points of this that, again, I know but others don't know, is what would happen is at that time you bought satellite time through AT&T and a couple of the other major carriers because they're the only ones that could afford satellites. And what would happen is if you went to Intelsat or Comsat, and you went to these carriers and you tried to book time, you can book satellite segment time on a transponder, but you could book it in 15-minute increments. Okay, now how do you reserve the booking? You can use a credit card. No joke. And so what would happen now is that people knew when we were going to publish, or when we were going to want to broadcast the All-Star game, when we were going to do the Super Bowl. And what people would do was they would go in and they would block 15 minutes of time in what they figured would be the only space segment available during that particular game. Then they would call up and they'd say, Captain Redding, I got a deal for you. I will sell you our reserve slot. Well, this became an increasing issue with us. And so that's when the director, Cranston, sat down and said, okay, what does it take to set up our own satellite network? Because concurrently, stateside, CNN was showing the viability of a satellite network, and a satellite-only distribution system. So with them basically having that kind of a lead on us, we knew that distributing programming this way was certainly possible. What we had to do was then negotiate the landing rights in those countries where our signal could be broadcast. And so that was, again, part of the challenge. And I had mentioned earlier that in our sidebar that we had then established a network, but we didn't have much in the way of programming. We were sending videotapes around the world, 3/4-inch cassettes, blue, by the way, because that was the only color that 3M would allow. Was AFRTS color was blue. If you saw a blue AFRTS, if you saw a blue 3/4-inch cassette, you knew that it was government property, because that was guarantee we had from 3M that we were the only ones that had that color blue. So it's kind of cute, but a little sidebar thing. But we knew then that we simply had to go that way to satellite. So we wound up doing a deal with CNN. I forget the operations guy name, but our contracting office in Los Angeles basically negotiated a one-page memorandum with CNN that allowed us then to downlink their programming and flip it to our AFRTS stations overseas. And then when local programming was not available or something else, the master control technician could simply flip the master switch, and we just simply run CNN, deleting the commercials and then inserting our own PSAs.
Great. So that's AFIS, what you did, and then
I was officially assigned to AFIS. I've never had an AFRTS assignment, although I basically was the point of contact for all of their funding and all of their personnel at the headquarters level. Okay. Not the individual stations, because those are the purview of the military departments, but anything that was at the DOD level was under my umbrella.
Gotcha. So where do we go from there?
Well, I'm doing fairly well and kind of liking my job at AFIS, because I had a lot of control. I was doing all kinds of stuff that you know, that was interest to me, you know, and that it always makes the job kind of fun. And even turning around a former executive officer at the 82nd Airborne who came in romping, stomping colonel, and who was this guy in civilian clothes? And I turned him around. It took me about a few months, but I turned him around. But I got a call from my detailer, and he said, "GA, it's time for you to move. You were at Redstone Arsenal, and then you were in Indianapolis, and now you're here. So you've effectively been in the States now, you know, since 1972." And, you know, so that's about 6 or 7 years. It's time for you to go overseas. And I said, well, okay, you know, what have you got, Hank? What have you got? He says, well, I've got two assignments for you. And the first assignment is we have a position for you, an HE officer in Korea. And that would be an 18-month tour. For you, and that's certainly, you know, something based on your background. Get back to those good old AG roots, you know, which is not necessarily where I wanted to be, but it's where the AG people wanted me to be. And then he said, or how do you like camels? And I said, camels? And he said, well, yeah, I have an assignment opening up right now for a public affairs officer for the Multinational Force Observers in the Sinai Desert. And I'm going, okay, talk to me about that. And he said, well, you know the Camp David Accords. I said, yep, know the Camp David Accords. Well, this is the implementation of the Camp David Accords where the Sinai is going to be turned over from Israel to Egypt. We are moving in a contingent of Americans along with, you know, a part of 11-nation contingent into the Sinai Desert. This is outside the scope of the United Nations. The reason it being outside the scope of the United Nations is because if it was UN, then the Russians would want to have an equal leverage in it. And so you had Russian military forces working alongside US military forces. Somewhere along the line that didn't seem to fit very well. And so the decision was made to go to a separate agreement, a brand new international body called the Multinational Force Observers. The headquarters was in Rome, and it was staffed with a bunch of civilians and a former State Department chief. And then the force, the military contingents, were in the Sinai. And so the General Frederick Bull Hansen, a lieutenant general in the Norwegian Army, was in charge of the force. So I said, well, that sounds a little bit more interesting. He says, well, I'll sweeten the deal for you. Once you complete your assignment, then I'll give you the follow-on assignment anywhere you want to go. And I thought, well, this is a pretty good deal. So I said, well, then I just want to come back to the DC area because I'm established here, got a home here. So he said, done, consider it done. So it's kind of nice when you can work with your detailer on that kind of an environment. And I said, you know, just as long as we all understand, I'm good to go with that. So he said, okay, you're going to get 30 days leave because this is a PCS and all that. And but you need to go check in with the multinational force, and oh, by the way, you probably ought to check in with the Army Chief of Public Affairs. And I said, got it. So I went to the Multinational Force and Observers headquarters, which is behind a shopping center up here off of Franconia Road, and I met the staff there and a few other people. The general called me in. Gave me a bit of a critique. He had a bio on me that had already been sent to him. And I was picked basically because I was a public affairs officer in Vietnam. I was a broadcast instructor in all phases of journalism, you know, so I'd already been tested by fire, you know, and I had at a policy level, I could write whatever instructions they wanted. So I was sort of, you know, the right guy at the right fit. And so I went through the interview process and sailed through that. And then I went over and presented myself to the Army Chief of Public Affairs, General Sullivan, who then called me into the office without benefit of having too many other people in there, sat down, looked at my record, and I said, well, you've been nominated, and I want to go through all this and this. And so I basically satisfied all of his concerns, and his parting shot to me was, he said, by that time I'm a major, and he said, Major, there will be no bad story coming out of the Sinai involving U.S. troops. Am I understood? I said, yes, sir. So basically that was my marching orders.
Yeah.
But beyond that conversation, I had almost no contact with anybody in Army Public Affairs for the duration of my assignment in the Sinai.
Huh.
So, that's kind of where that one
Yeah.
went. But so I did a 1-year tour in the Sinai as, again, carrying over a lot of the skills I did in Vietnam. Photography, visitors bureau, meeting with dignitaries, escorting the press around when they came, and I basically documented what went on for that 1 year in the Sinai.
Any one notable incident that you remember?
There were a couple of incidents. Of course, the day that the Sinai was officially turned over from the Israeli government to the Egyptian government, that was sort of an interesting day in infamy, because the Israelis flew in to the airbase rather early, and they took down the Israeli flag, and they left without much of a ceremony. Okay, they really didn't want to be a part of this.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the Egyptians came in like a C-130. They came in, and a whole horde of Egyptians came in, and they landed, and so we went through a flag raising ceremony where the Egyptian flag was now put next to the Multinational Force Observers flag. And again, I documented how that didn't necessarily go as smoothly as it could have, but also during that particular time frame, a storm appeared over the Sinai with a spiral cloud coming down, and it was very biblical. I mean, in the transformation, and I've got basically all this kind of captured on film as well. And I've kept that as part of a separate chapter to a chronology that I've kept in my time in the desert. But there were other interesting things as a public affairs guy that you run across. When the Israelis moved out of the Sinai, they basically pulled out all of the infrastructure. Okay, if you didn't buy it, they bombed it, or they destroyed it. And at the air base, we were at the Northern Command. There were runways going this way. Well, we bought this runway. We didn't buy that runway. Okay, so one morning, about the time I'm getting up, Israelis come in and bomb it. They actually just they cratered the runway we didn't buy. I mean, there's a scorched earth policy that they believe in, that they will leave nothing to the enemy's advantage. And the same thing with the kibbutz, because the northern Sinai had all kinds of kibbutzim, and the Israelis, when they moved the population out, they would literally take road graders in and basically destroy the kibbutz. Sure, if you didn't buy it, it was going to be destroyed.
After the Sinai, where do we go?
Well, after the Sinai, because I'd worked out that arrangement with my detailer that I would go back to Washington, then I picked up an assignment as the executive officer of the U.S. Army Audiovisual Center in the Pentagon. And so basically that put me in a position of an operation that had, again, Army audiovisual responsibilities throughout the Pentagon. The Pentagon Auditorium, the Pentagon War Rooms, all this sort of stuff, and a bunch of satellite audiovisual offices in the National Capital Region. The NASA building had one, the Fort Belvoir, Fort Meade. All these people had audiovisual needs, and so that was my assignment. Basically, was to manage that as any XO would do with personnel actions. Again, I was involved in budgeting. This is the time that we started moving from analog audiovisual systems into digital information systems. I had a couple of noteworthy things that I did when I was there. As an aside, I had responsibility over the Army Combat Photo Team, which was then located in Fort Meade, Maryland. And these are the same guys, a decade removed, that I'd worked with in Vietnam. The Army combat photographers, and so I could speak their language and all that. And so I would get a call saying, "We need people to go cover this assignment. And this is very loose, and it always struck me as being kind of loose. You get a call from the Army Operations Center that said, hey, we've got something going on in Grenada. Can you send a photographer down? Okay, so I called up, one of the fellows I knew up there, one of the NCOs, and I said, I got a mission order for you. And he said, oh, hey, sir, can I go? I said, knock yourself out. You got to, get yourself immunized and report to Andrews Air Force Base at, such and such a time. Here's a contact number to get all your stuff, all your gear in order. And he went down there and ultimately flew down to Grenada. He basically wasn't sponsored because he didn't have a unit he was affiliated with, So when he landed at the airport, and again it was a commercial airport, he goes to the Hertz rental car place, and he rents a Hertz rental car for his operational requirements. And so he actually sent me a picture back, which is one of those few that I just didn't have, but he had a picture of his American Express card saying "Don't go to war without it," And but he actually commandeered the station managers of the Hertz manager's car. That was the last one. He had a card, so he had the station manager's card. So that was one incident. That was I thought was pretty funny. The next one came up. I got a call a little bit later on, and again I have all this recorded in firm documents and stuff, but I got a call saying we need to go, we're sending troops into Tegucigalpa in Central America. And I said, got it. And he said, well, we need a combat camera team to go in. We need to cover this with imagery. Okay, so I said, okay, I'll take care of it. And again, this is really informal stuff, and I just don't believe how we got away with it at that time. So I called up and I said, I got some contact numbers and some other stuff. Same bit. There's always a rally point over at Andrews Air Force Base that everybody left from. So I called up the commander of the Combat Pictorial Unit in Fort Meade, and I said, well, I got a mission order. I got this, and this. And we need this. We need video, we need still, we need film, we need audio. We need a team of probably 3 or 4 different people, and all that. And so I laid the whole thing out. And I got, yes, sir. I got the typical yes, sir. And I said, are there any other questions? And she said, I've got one. And I said, okay, Captain, what's your question? She says, can I go? And I said, you're the captain of the unit. You're the commander of the unit. Make a command decision, Captain. She said, thank you, sir. Thank you. So she went. Huh. She was jump qualified. Yeah. Signal Corps officer, jump qualified. She reported. She goes down there for a month or whatever it was. She came back up to the office in the Pentagon, when her tour was done. Reported to me at the desk, almost with tears in her eyes. That she was so grateful that I had offered her that opportunity. But that was and that lasted for a little bit. She left and all that. Well, the colonel in charge of the Audiovisual Center, Colonel Van Orden, who I'd placed there earlier, said, GA, come here. So I go in and say, shut the door. Shut the door. He said, what were you thinking of? You sent a woman into a combat zone. Do you know that I've been called on that? And I said, okay. He said, you sent a woman into a combat zone. What were you thinking? And I said, well, sir, I was letting her do her job. Because if you look at the TDA which is the table of allowances and distribution, or distribution allowances, typically the job assignments are coded. They're coded by rank and by branch and all that. There's also a coding for gender. There was no coding for gender at the Combat Pictorial Office. It wasn't there. And I said, in the absence of a coding for for gender, why not? She's a commander. Yeah. And then he started laughing. He said, well, okay. He says, I've got something I can take back to him. That there was no coding on that. And subsequently then, the other 2 female officers at the Audiovisual Center in different, came to me, can I go? And so I actually rotated through 2 more female captains to cover audiovisual activities in that particular operation. Subsequently, I did meet with the Joint Staff in what I think is if I recall, Joint Pub number 2 or something like that. But basically, I worked with the Joint Staff to ensure that there was a placeholder in the operations orders that required them to make a call for audiovisual support. It had never been done before. It was always by who you knew and stuff like that. Yeah. But I consider that one of my better achievements there was to make that part of the formal checklist that they had to go through so that they could have proper documentary support for military operations. It just fascinated me that it was not codified.
And this is probably about mid-80s,
This is 85.
85?
This is 85. And then in 85, the Army decided to reorganize in something called the Information Management Area, or Information Management Activity. And so this, because we're becoming more electronically oriented and stuff like that. And so I started taking a look at the information, and basically they were capturing everything. They were capturing everything that had to do with sound, motion, media, data storage, and stuff like that. And they were all going to put it in this digital format. Well, that's kind of okay, but not all audiovisuals in digital, okay? So I'm taking a look at this information management activity coming in and subsuming the Army Audiovisual Center, which had worked for the Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations, but was now being transferred to 7th Signal Corps. So now now the center was going to be put under 7th Signal Corps, so we're losing a direct chain of command. Yeah. And I took a look around at this and I said, well, I think it's about time for me to leave. And so I called up my friends down at Washington Headquarters Services that I'd worked with for a long time, and I said, I'm dealing with American Forces Information Service again. They would like to have me back over there. Can we make that happen? Sure, GA, for you? Yeah, we'll make that happen. And so within the matter of a few weeks, I was by name requested again, and the Army honored the by name request. And so I again moved back to the American Forces Information Service into the Defense Audiovisual Policy Office. And because again of my audiovisual background, and they had a requirement for it, and so that's where I plopped.
Yeah, and that's that's your final assignment?
Yes, I had 2 different positions there as Chief of Audiovisual Resources and Chief of Audiovisual Facilities for the DOD. Mm-hmm. And so those were my 2 assignments, and I stayed there until I retired in 1990 in lieu of an onerous assignment, again, someplace I didn't want to go. I don't know that you want to get involved in what I did at AFIS in those 2 assignments, but it was, a lot of it was very groundbreaking and stuff that you're very familiar with, but you don't know that the Army did it, or you don't know that DOD drove DVD.
Give me an example.
Well, as we were converting from analog video to digital video, the resolution of pixel resolution became important. Now remember, this was a very early on when we started digitizing imagery. And so when I was on audiovisual products, I used to work with Sony, buying Sony gear and camera equipment for AFRTS. So the Sony guys knew me. And so I came in one day in my office, the Sony rep came in with this rather clumsy looking camera. And it was a digital video camera still. And it took a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, and you shoved it into a slot. And we all remember maybe not everybody remembers 5 1/4, but they were 5 1/4 inch discs. And you shoved this thing into a slot, and then you look through it to like the old Graflex cameras, and you could take a picture. Well, this was a marvel of technology. Now remember, those floppy disks didn't carry much data. Okay, so this disk was good for only 12 images, in black and white only at a resolution of 240 by 320. I mean,
yeah,
absolutely horrible, but it was it was what they had.
yeah.
And so I looked at it, took a couple pictures. We're all yucking around the office and stuff like that. And I'd had my fill of it, and I actually took it and I flipped it in the air to my Air Force colleague in there, and he caught it. And the Sony guy about had a heart attack. I mean, he was just beside himself. There are only 3 cameras like that in the world. You know, there was one at Sony R&D, there was one at headquarters Sony, and the one that we had in the office. It was about a $250,000 camera.
Yikes.
You know, and here I am flipping it. So, but we like the idea, and ultimately, and again, I've got most of the documentation on that as to how we worked with that camera and how we started to migrate into digital media formats. The first CDs were all analog. People don't remember that. They were NTSC analog or PAL, and so we had to figure out a way, how do we take the analog signals and digitize them, and what format are we going to use? Nobody had done this before. And so the idea is, how do we set up a file format so that we can encode the pits on the disk? And so this became a large bone of contention. Hitachi had a way of doing it. Sony had a way of doing it. And well, Sony and Philips had the same way, because all CDs belong to Sony and Philips, by the way. They own the patent for CDs, okay? But you had RCA coming in, you had Panasonic coming in. Everybody had a different way to encode a compact disc. And so we had to figure out exactly how that disc was to be mapped and how all the data was to be mapped on that disc. And at this particular point, I was working with the DOD training community, OASD personnel and readiness, and because they were interested in using CDs as a distribution media for military training.
Sure.
Okay, makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
And so I was applying my audiovisual background, and they were wanting an education and training application. And so the idea is, how do we do this, and how do we make sure that we get these? Because the key point is, as they were moving into digital, whose domain did they follow in? The IM guys, the computer guys. Okay?
Yeah.
So at that point, I did an end run. I went to GSA, and I worked with them. They considered this a military problem, but I worked with them to ensure that the GSA classification always identified CDs as an audiovisual product, not as a computer product. They could put it in a computer if they wanted to, but it was going to get locked down also as an audiovisual product. So I felt really, really good about that. But we had a lot of work to do, trying to figure out whose format would work. Ultimately, I was in a position before I left the military to fund NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, to work with me in the DOD. They want a lot of money, but to work with the DOD to establish a digital standard for CDs. Okay, because once we couldn't go beyond that, we had to lock it down. So I shepherded that for a while with industry people, and it took a couple of years, because trust me, when you're dealing with RCA, Sony, Hitachi, Panasonic, these are heavyweight players, and they all want their proprietary system to prevail. So ultimately, with a group of subject matter experts and a bunch of geeks in Vancouver it was in the city of Vancouver on a little island out there.
Yeah.
Above a nightclub one night, we finally locked down what the CD standard would be. Okay, with the file format and everything else. But this was similarly very important, because without locking down what an agreed upon industry standard was for compact disc, we couldn't move to DVD. Okay, because CDs were still trying to find their niche. Were they digital text materials? Were they still images? Were they graphics? Were they motion media?
Yeah.
So what was this thing called a CVD? What's the information it could contain, and how would that be manipulated, and how would it be exhibited and stuff like that? So after some discussion, we settled on the term DVD. Now most people don't know what DVD stands for. It stands for Digital Versatile Disc. So we ensured the versatility of it.
Yeah.
And if you go on Wikipedia, you will see that DVD is done first, but that's something we hashed out, in a meeting above a nightclub,
Yeah.
in Granville Island in Vancouver. I mean,
You got to feel good about being a part of that.
yeah, I did it pretty. I mean, that makes it kind of fun to be a part of that. And again, I have this all laid out in about this time though. See, we were starting to get PCs, so now I had the ability now to have records. So now I've got all kinds of digital files. My big problem, of course, is now converting old files into new files, and I need to do that without breaking the chain of custody, if you will, on how that document was authored. Yeah. But then once we moved to that, then I got pretty well known for getting involved in that kind of stuff, and then I applied that to video teleconferencing. Yeah. And so basically I wrote the DOD instructions on video teleconferencing, because again, we had to take now digital cameras, and then we had to move them across codecs, which are compression decompression devices, to move into somebody else's system. And so what would happen was, initially you would have an NTSC wave signal go into a codec. It would be digitized, it would be sent across a line someplace else, go to the receiving entity, and then reconstituted as NTSC broadcast signal again. I mean, a lot of this stuff was very, very kludgy. And when we started working across networks, we would basically daisy chain these codecs, hoping that we wouldn't lose signal on this. But that's basically how the original teleconferences were set up. Huh. Until we started working with it. And at that time I was working, because the original video teleconferencing at desktop level was NTSC. It was broadcast television quality, and it was done by a company called Data Point. And the Data Point came to me because I was audiovisual policy again, and so Data Point came to me with what looked like a monitor. It looked like one of those early Apple monitors, and it had an NTSC signal in it, and then you flip a switch, and then you've got your computer. So you could flip the switch to do your word processing, or flip it, and then you'd have a regular TV image on it. Well, it came to a hub, and the hub had 8 little ports on it, and so you actually had to hardwire, to the hub, and it went through your telephone line. So you would call up somebody on your telephone, and you would dial in their hub number, and then their image would appear on your screen. I mean, well, this is 1985. This is sci-fi stuff. This is heavy. This is really heavy-duty stuff. And so I set up a hub and spoke system at the AFIS headquarters, and then I set up another hub and spoke system at OSD Public Affairs. So basically, that was the first installation of desktop video in DOD. Wow. And it was analog at that time. And so again, I have that written up, but it's, again, this history is there. You just kind of learn, you got to figure out how to find it. But,
so those are two of the major things you kind of think about in your last assignment, I imagine.
Yeah. In my, and that was part of the military stuff I was working on. But once I got out of the military, then I got involved in 2 presidential initiatives. Again, in both cases, I was requested because somebody figured out who I was and what I was up to. And the first one I got involved in was called the President's Technology Initiative, and that was to provide computers and stuff into the DOD school system, and teleconferencing technologies and stuff like that. So I worked, and so I had to lay out a video teleconferencing protocol and everything as it would apply to the DOD school system, which it was a very large school system. It was a $1 billion budget, and at one time was the 3rd largest school district in the U.S. We had a lot of people overseas. But the idea is that the headquarters wanted to connect students with technology, They needed a way to do that. They were thinking that the circuits would work. We had to work out deals where, again, using military circuits was not an option, because the dot mil guys don't particularly want the elementary school using their bandwidth. And so DODDS actually runs two. They run a .com and a .mil environment. So we had to set that up for the schools overseas. So that was the one technology environment I got involved in. The second one was a lot more interesting.
Hold on, just. Okay, so DOD.
Okay, so this is another one of the presidential projects I was involved in. I got a call from the National Institute of Justice asking me to set up a website for DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, that's what it is.
You learned that.
You learn that. Okay, this was referred to as the President's DNA Initiative, the PDI, and basically the President had provided funding to the Justice Department, to the National Institute of Justice, to set up a system to teach crime labs throughout the country on the use and application of DNA marking in criminology. And so I was, well, hey, this is pretty good. But they got me because I'd set up websites before. It was audiovisual based, a lot of I said, cool, this is good stuff. And so I was detailed over to NIJ, had offices,
NIJ being?
National Institute of Justice.
Got it.
And so I had offices downtown, Chinatown. And I worked and they wanted to set in, and as with big organizations like Justice, they have their incumbent IT guy who wants to take over control of everything. And I basically laid this out as a separate, distinct project. I wanted to use technologies that were different, and they agreed. So we retained a firm in Ballston to put this, a company called DODDS. And we used a Courseware platform that allowed us to put courses online, to have students enroll, take the courses, get grades, and a whole bunch of other stuff. The courseware was furnished by half a dozen or so academic institutions, to include the National Forensics Lab and stuff like that. It was my responsibility to set up the website, to also then review the courseware for applicability. Does it in fact fit a distance learning, kind of environment? To that end, I met with subject matter experts at Dartmouth, at Justice, the federal prosecutors' offices, and Alexander, a whole bunch of stakeholders, because they wanted this for criminal prosecution purposes. So I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody in defense, in criminal defense. The prosecutors and the district attorneys were all involved, and they didn't want, they wanted it to be all key this way. And so we basically put the website up. It existed, and we won a couple of awards for the best government website. Based on ease of access and stuff like that. But realistically, you could go in and take a course, and you can still do that now. Even though the site that I designed has been taken down, you can noodle through and find. But you can actually take a course on how to go into a contaminated room and find different pieces of evidence in order to build a case. But I did that for about 3 years. And in doing so, a whole world opens up to you when you start talking about DNA. You've seen the people where they put the stuff in the machine and they have the tubes and all that.
Yeah. I
went through the course. I can do all that. I've done all that. I've taken samples and stuff like that. It's kind of a fun deal. So I can practice what I preach in a lot of this stuff. And again, that wasn't without some problems. But I thought one of the great things was that as part of the President's initiative, this is a .gov website that is fully open to the public, so anybody can go in there. And I thought this was great. And so I went back to my DOD schools people and I said, hey, look, for science class and stuff like that, why don't you take this and put this link in, and you can teach people some basic biology, some basic forensic science, and they can actually have courses that somebody's already done that you can take, and it's all free. And then again, some of the institutions like Marshall Institution, University of West Virginia, major players, Stetson University, these academic institutions, you could take the same course and matriculate, and then work on a degree program if you wanted to as well. But I just thought it was kind of cool, because the lab technicians that you hear so much about doing DNA testing and stuff like that, it's actually pretty rigorous. They're given a sample kit. Or at least I can only talk to what I did back then. You're given a box of evidence about every 6 months. And then you're supposed to go in and do your reviews and your reports and all that to be recertified. So this is one of those skill areas where you need to be a certified technician. And one of the overall goals of this was to become a certified forensic technician. So it was quite an interesting experience.
Okay, you retired from the military in 1990. Made that decision based upon what you said. It was time to go because they were
time to go. Okay. Well, yeah, and it was a very timely decision, because this was in July of 1990.
I know where you're going.
Okay, and my detailer was going, and my detailer was kind of fun, because I'd been once he told me I had to either move or retire. I said, well, I'm going to retire. And I started working with him, you know. He says, okay, I'll send me some paperwork and I'll send it here. So I said, I'm going to retire in December of 1990. Why not, right? It's close a year and all that, and I take my 30 days leave over Christmas. I mean, it's all a very happy thing to do. And so I'm busy working on that. And as I'm going through my closeout stuff, then I have to go to the OSD General Counsel to get an indemnification that although I'd worked with these major corporations, that it would not be a barrier to follow-on employment, like Sony and Panasonic and all those folks. And so I did all that, and I'm working my way through all this, and I let everybody talk to the boss, let the boss know and all that. And so somewhere along the line, OSD personnel calls up and says, you need a fitness report. Yeah, okay. So, and they say, you've not had a fitness report written on you in a couple of years. And I said, no, okay, probably so. And they said, well, we can't get you out without a fitness report, and we can't process your paperwork. And so they sent me all the materials, and I had my fitness report and all that kind of stuff, and I looked at it and it's been fine. So I trotted it into my boss, an Air Force colonel, and I said, Colonel Anderson, in order for me to, processing my retirement, I gave him all this stuff in letter form. I said, I'm processing my retirement and I need a fitness report executed. And he looked at it and he said, all right, I'll take care of it. So I go back into my office and minding my own business. And, sometime later he walks in and he has my folder. And he says, I'm not writing this, you're going to write it. And he puts it down on my paper, I just threw it down on my desk. And I give him one of those, kind of looks. So he goes back in his office, so he could do whatever it was he did. And I was never quite sure what he did. and so I stewed on it for a little bit. And I picked up the paper, my folder, walked back into his office, sat down at his desk, said, Colonel, do your job. I can have you court-martialed for that. I said, have at it. I'm getting out of the service. It was just, that was sort of the dialogue. It was really, because as soon as I announced my retirement, he had a project list of stuff he didn't want to have done. That I said, we need to do this, didn't want to do it. And all of a sudden I'm retiring, and he's got this big bad project list that he wants me to now tackle. And I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do it. I made it myself. So now I'm starting to move. So now I moved from December to September, and then I'm moving from September to August, you know, and so I'm busy collapsing now my my retirement time, and I'm keeping my detailer informed. I said, I'd like to move it up if I can. Sure, we'll take care of you, Jay. Yeah, sure. So we start collapsing the retirement date, and finally I just had enough, and I said, I'm out of here at the end of July. You know, count me out. And so called the detailer, and he said, well, he said, yeah, okay, we can do that, but I really don't want to see you go. He says, you know, you've got a lot to contribute to the military, and you know, because you follow my career. And he says, and I've read your bio, and I've read the stuff you've done, and I've talked to your colleagues, and he said, I've got 2 assignments for you. He said, you can be the assistant professor of military science at Fordham University, or you can be the chief of command information at Fort McPherson, Georgia. Oh, got a response out of you. Okay, that's good. See, you can see where this is going. And I'm going, gee, these are 2 unfun jobs. You know, living in New York City with the cost of, oh, you could work on your degree program, that'd be fine. Fort McPherson, Georgia, why in the world would I want to get caught in that mess? And so I declined both of those. You know, said, no, can't do it. And he said, okay. I agree. He said, all right, I just had to test you. You know, just, you know, like, you know, he's fishing. He's fishing for somebody, and I didn't bite. So, you know, a week or so passes, and he said, okay, I've got 2 more assignments for you. And he said, one's overseas and one's CONUS. I said, all right, overseas, where? He said, well, I want you to be the executive officer of Stars and Stripes newspapers in Darmstadt, Germany. He said, you're, you know, public affairs, you know, all the background. You're the assistant publisher or executive officer for Stars and Stripes in Europe. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting, you know, that's okay. And I said, what's the next one? He said, well, the next one is I'm going to offer you the commander position of the 560th Signal Battalion at Lowry Air Force Base. And I went, oh, now that's a real draw. Okay, because I knew the incumbent, because Lowry Air Force Base, the Signal Battalion there taught all the audiovisual except for what DINFOS teaches. Okay, you know, they were the combat cameramen, they were the photographers, you know, they were everything else that journalism wasn't. Okay, and I knew the commander there because I'd put him there in a position earlier on, you know, so and all that. Plus, for an AG officer, this was a green tab position.
Oh yeah.
I mean, very rare, you know, I mean, you just don't come by those very often, you know, especially as a lieutenant colonel. And then at being in Denver, Lowry Air Force Base, then I could simply go back to the University of Denver and work on my doctoral degree. You know, so I mean, all the stars were lining up, you know, I mean, this one was probably the most tempting position that I'd ever been offered. And I thought about it, and I had to sort of, you know, make a decision one way or the other. And I said, well, yeah, I just can't do it. I've cast my lot, and so I'm going to stick with it. Now, epilogue. As it turned out, I would have never gone to either one of the 2 places. Okay, because after my retirement, you know, I still talk to my detailer and stuff like we're closing out some stuff, but I'd officially gone on terminal leave and all that. And he said, well, GA, he said, well, we have this Desert Storm operation. And he said, I had set your file aside and not processed it because you had the background in the Sinai, you had the background of Vietnam, you had the background in DINFOS, you had the background at OSD Public Affairs. You were my #1 pick to be in General Schwarzkopf's Public Affairs office. And I'm going, okay. Now, other colleagues of mine in the Navy and Air Force at AFIS did in fact go, but they were sent by the DOD Public Affairs Office. They were sent out of that office. And I again communicated with these guys, and they said, GA, not going was probably one of the best decisions you ever made, because Schwarzkopf killed his Army guys.
Right.
He said he couldn't touch us, you know, but he took his Army guys, and whatever frustration he had, he simply took it out on them. He said it had been very tough for you to survive, given your personality.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are guys that would go over there that are lockstep and would, you know, ISR and all, but I've just never been that way. So I probably, ultimately, that was a better decision for me.
Yeah. Looking back on your military service, how do you reflect back on that? I mean, certainly it was a great part of your life, and
for me, it was a positive. It was everything was positive. I can't think of a bummer of an assignment that I had. Every assignment that I had was a growth assignment. They were all progressional. You know, sometimes you get stuck in one where you feel like you've been sidelined. Yeah. You know, and each one of the positions I had, I was given the opportunity to do what I felt was best to pursue the mission, and that's really very important. I'm not a regulations kind of guy, but I am the author of the DOD regulations for combat camera. I am the author of the DOD for visual information, and I am the author for AFRTS. So when we were changing the satellite system, I rewrote all of those DOD instructions and all those DOD directives. Now the interesting thing was, and I did just say visual information. Well, it's very interesting how we came to visual information, because I'm sitting there. This is after my assignment in the Pentagon, and I was moved back to AFIS. There was this move toward, again, the information world was taking over, and we tried to work that to our advantage. Concurrently, there was a Senator Goldwater, a Goldwater commission that was looking at Pentagon, Hollywood on the Potomac, as too much audiovisual was coming out of the Pentagon and all that. And again, the DOD does more audiovisual than any other federal agency, followed by the Veterans Administration, interestingly enough. So we sat in a room one day, and this was with people from the OSD comptroller, my AFIS boss, and a couple of others. There were like 4 or 5 of us. There weren't very many of us. And we sat down, we said, we've got to do something about this to hide the budget. And I was the budget, you know, based on my budget experience, we've got to hide the budget. How do we do that? So we're looking at it, and we're going audiovisual, they're after audiovisual, they're after audiovisual. Most of what we do is visual. Got it. Why don't we change it to visual information and not audiovisual? And so basically what we did, and one of the reasons why we rewrote the directives, is we removed the word audiovisual from the DOD instructions and the DOD directives. It was kept in the glossary identifying what it was. Yeah. You know, motion media with sound. Okay, but everything else, still imagery is not audio, right? So still imagery was visual information. So we had photographs, we had computer graphics, we had all this other stuff we identified as visual information. So basically then what we did was we took audiovisual off of the congressional budget line item and basically saved the program. So that's how visual information came about in the military. And when we told the services we're doing that, they were delighted. Yeah. And so every one of them changed their programs to read visual information. And that's what you see now, even now, you see visual information this, visual information that, and that's how the term visual information came to be. Huh. Now, which one of the 4 or 5 of us in the room thought it up, I don't know. Yeah. But it was, and then for me it was because we had the Defense Audiovisual Information System that I just changed, and then we had the Defense Automated Technical Information System, and I just changed it, say, instead of saying audiovisual, I just said automated visual. Yeah. See, so I changed audio to automated, and the databases all worked, so it was a database change so that when you go into the archives and the records and stuff, you can still search on the same terms and find what you want.
The goal of the Veterans History Project is for veterans to tell about their human experience of serving in the military. From what I've seen, you are doing both today and have been doing for some time, is doing just that. What's the value of that for you, and what do you think the value of that would be for anyone?
Well, I think there's a rounding out experience that you get, and I tried not to make my military experience military. You know, I'm just not that kind of I'm not that kind of person. You know, I've probably been in 1 or 2 formations in my entire military career. You know, I've never done a parade. You know, none of the stuff that you would associate with being in the military. I just haven't followed that track. But for me, I found it, if you go in with an objective and you know what you want to do, you can generally work the system to your favor. And I think I proved that, you know, to a point. And I did that without really compromising, you know, where I wanted to go. So everything sort of fit neatly for me. I mean, you know, I worked at it, you know, really hard, and I built relationships that with people outside my chain of command that allowed me to flourish. You know, and I think that's important too. Yeah. Because, you know, I work with the news media. Okay, I'm not going to get a bad story. When you work with these guys and you go down, you know, in Vietnam, we'd go to, you know, a bar downtown Da Nang, and very dimly lit, you know, and we'd be drinking something we weren't quite sure what it was, and eating food that in the dark made crunching sounds when you ate it. But you get in this, I'm going to eat it, you're going to eat it. You get in those environments, yeah. and it becomes very, you know, very important. But when you get involved in these different cultures in the military, then you got to learn to adapt. And I think the ability for me to adapt to the cultures, it was again very instrumental. Every one of us in the Sinai was handpicked. You know, the 30 of us that were there. Okay. Everybody had very different skills, you know, be it a military police guy, the signal guy, me, somebody else. A few of them, if you remember Desert One, you know, when the failed helicopters going in to rescue the hostages, okay, 3 or 4 of the guys in the MFO were in Tehran, in the mountains. Mm. You know, that's how deep they were. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the signal guy actually knew why the system failed. He was kind of fun to talk to later on, because the operation is being controlled by the White House, not by the commander in the field. Yeah. You know, the White House wanted to know it, and so, but you work with these people and you adapt to their culture, and so these are guys from the 2nd Ranger Battalion. You know, PSYOPs. These are hardcore guys, and I mean, and a couple of them. I mean, even though we were colleagues in the Sinai and we were all in the same uniform, I have no doubt that they would have taken out a knife and killed me if that was their mission. I mean, this is just how these guys think. I mean, it's really strange, but you sort of embrace that lifestyle. And so while I was in the Sinai, one of the things that I did is I noticed that the lieutenant colonel in charge of operations, an Army lieutenant colonel, wore his sleeves up, you know, in his battle dress uniform. Sleeves were always up and cuffed, you know. And the first time the 82nd came in, all the sleeves were down. Okay, you know, all the sleeves were down. Yeah. And so this guy wore his cuffs up all the time. And I thought, okay, I can do that too. So I kept my cuffs up. So no matter how cold it got, how wet it got, or anything else for my 1 year in the Sinai, you never saw me in uniform unless I had my cuffs up. That brought me a lot of cred. Yeah. I mean, I got a lot of street cred on that, because, you know, AG guy, you know, you know, what is, but I played, you know, but I was more than happy to work with it, you know, and the same thing. When the first Army troops landed at the South Camp in the Sinai, it was a road march. And because they wanted to be macho, you know, and you'll get that on on the stuff I got. Well, they wanted to be the macho about this road march. Well, they were road marching with their sleeves down, but the commander of the unit was Lieutenant Colonel Garrison. Okay, now Lieutenant Colonel Garrison had just done. They wanted to parachute in. I mean, this is You know, Airborne Ranger, death from the sky is their motto. You know, they got this, all kinds of paraphernalia, but death from the sky. And they wanted to parachute in. And Force Commander said, you can parachute in here. This is a peacekeeping operation. But they had this road march. Well, Garrison had done a jump a couple weeks earlier and broken his ankle. And so he was in a boot. And he wanted to road march the 5 miles or whatever it was to the base camp, to the South Camp. And he started, and finally, you know, his NCO put him in a Jeep. Yeah. You know, said, Colonel, you know, it's one thing to be macho, but it's another thing to, you know, to injure yourself where you can't command. Yeah. And so in the photographs that I have of the force commander welcoming the battalion to the South Command, up on the podium, you can see Lieutenant Colonel Garrison with his boot on, you know, so a little piece of history. Now, of course, Garrison later became the Black Hawk Down. Yeah. He was the commanding general in charge of that operation. Yeah. So, you know, but at that time it was GA and Bill, you know, because I was effectively his public affairs officer too, you know, for U.S. forces in there.
Well, GA, I think we're going to stop there.
Okay.
Thank you for telling your story.
You know where to find me.
I know where to find you. I know we're going to get a lot more with the material you've written up and you're going to present to them, but on behalf of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, thanks for giving us your time.
You're certainly welcome.